On February 10, 2020, Hannah Clarke told a colleague something deeply alarming. She believed her estranged husband, Rowan Baxter, could kill her if he ever got her alone. 9 days later, Hannah and her 3 children, 6-year-old Aaliyah, 4-year-old Laianah, and 3-year-old Trey, were dead. By then, Hannah had already left. She had moved the children into her parents' home. Police were involved. A protection order was in place. Lawyers were helping manage contact with the children. Hannah was doing what people are often told to do when they believe they are in danger. Yet none of it was enough to stop what happened on the morning of February 19, 2020. In the months and years that followed, the case forced investigators, lawmakers, and the wider public to confront a difficult question. How could the danger have become so severe when much of the abuse did not fit the traditional image of domestic violence? The answer was not hidden in one isolated incident. It was in a pattern that had been building for years. Jealousy, surveillance, isolation, rules, punishment, control. To understand the danger Hannah had been describing, investigators would have to look beyond the final weeks and examine the pattern that came before them. Afterward, Hannah's case would help change the way coercive control was discussed and eventually addressed in Queensland. But to understand how Hannah reached the point of fearing for her life, the story has to go back years earlier, before the police reports, before the protection order, and before leaving became the only option she believed she had left. Long before Hannah Clarke's name became associated with one of Australia's most confronting domestic violence cases, she was known by the people around her as energetic, determined, and deeply devoted to her family. Hannah was born in Brisbane in 1988 and grew up deeply involved in sport, competing in trampoline at a high level. Fitness remained central to her life as she got older and eventually became part of her career. In 2008, while working at the Carindale Police Citizens Youth Club, Hannah met Rowan Baxter. Hannah was around 20 years old at the time. Baxter was more than a decade older and was still living with his first wife when their relationship began. The two eventually built a life together. They married in October 2012 and went on to have 3 children. Aaliyah was born in 2013. Laianah followed in 2015. Then came Trey in 2016. Hannah threw herself into motherhood. Photos shared by her family showed birthdays, outings, sport, and the ordinary routines of raising 3 young children. Aaliyah was the eldest, followed by Laianah, then Trey, the youngest. Fitness also became a shared business venture for Hannah and Baxter. Together, they operated gyms and worked within the CrossFit community. From the outside, they could appear to be a young family building a business while raising 3 children. But the life Hannah experienced inside the relationship was increasingly different from the one visible from the outside. Over time, Baxter began placing restrictions on parts of her everyday life. He objected to certain clothes Hannah wore. He repeatedly contacted her when she was away from him. He interfered with her ability to maintain relationships with family and friends. Hannah was also prevented from having her own individual Facebook account. None of those behaviors, viewed alone, necessarily looked like the kind of violence many people were trained to recognize at the time. Together, however, they formed a pattern. The issue was not any one rule. It was how many parts of Hannah's independence were becoming subject to Baxter's approval. His control could also take the form of emotional punishment. The inquest later heard evidence of prolonged silent treatment and behavior that left Hannah feeling responsible when he was unhappy. At times, even the children became part of that dynamic, with activities planned for them taken away when Baxter was angry with Hannah. For years, those controlling behaviors existed alongside the ordinary routines of family life. But over time, Hannah began to see more clearly that the relationship was not simply difficult. It was restricting more and more of her independence. Eventually, she reached a point where staying no longer felt possible. Before we go deeper into what Hannah was experiencing, if you appreciate carefully researched true crime stories that look beyond the headlines, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps us continue telling these stories with the care they deserve. Over time, the control Hannah had been living with became increasingly intrusive. It reached beyond clothing and social relationships and into her phone, her movements, private conversations, and everyday decisions. Hannah became concerned that Baxter was monitoring her. At times, He appeared to know details of conversations that had taken place when he was not present. He checked her phone while she was sleeping and questioned her interactions with other people. What might have looked like jealousy from the outside had become something far more restrictive inside the relationship. Hannah increasingly had to think about how Baxter might react before making ordinary decisions. What Hannah was experiencing is now commonly understood as coercive control, not one isolated incident, but a repeated pattern that gradually reduces another person's independence. It can include surveillance, isolation, intimidation, financial pressure, humiliation, manipulation, and rules governing everyday life. Individually, some behaviors can appear minor. Together, they can create a system of control. For Hannah, that system was affecting more and more areas of her life. The restrictions already present in the relationship were now accompanied by increasingly intrusive monitoring and pressure. The couple's shared fitness business was also struggling. By late 2019, their Integ 8 gym was closing, and money was owed to investors, adding financial pressure to a relationship already under significant strain. That financial difficulty did not explain Baxter's behavior, but it created another area in which Hannah's personal and professional life remained closely tied to him. Hannah also described sexual coercion within the marriage, indicating that her boundaries were not always respected, even in deeply personal parts of the relationship. Emotional punishment remained another feature of the dynamic. Baxter could withdraw from Hannah for extended periods, creating an atmosphere in which she was expected to repair the situation when he was unhappy. The children could also become part of those conflicts, giving Baxter another way to place pressure on Hannah. For Hannah, leaving meant separating herself from someone with whom she shared 3 young children, finances, a business, and years of daily life, while already believing he was monitoring her closely. That made the decision more complicated than simply deciding the marriage was over. By November 2019, the strain had become impossible for Hannah to ignore. An incident surrounding a CrossFit competition left her deeply upset. Afterward, she spoke to a friend about what she had been living through. Hannah said she could not continue living that way. That moment marked an important change. She had reached the point where remaining in the marriage no longer felt possible. Hannah began preparing to leave carefully, knowing that separating their lives would involve far more than simply ending the relationship. In early December 2019, Hannah left Baxter and took Aaliyah, Laianah, and Trey with her. She moved into her parents' home in Camp Hill, Brisbane, creating physical distance from the relationship she had decided to end. But Hannah did not believe physical distance alone would necessarily make her safe. Believing Baxter may have been monitoring her movements, Hannah took precautions with her phone and car. On December 6, she went to Coronial police station and spoke with Senior Constable Kirsten Kent about what had been happening. The conversation included the possibility of applying for a domestic violence order. Hannah was hesitant about taking that step because she feared formal action could provoke Baxter and make the situation worse. Meanwhile, contact between Baxter and the children continued. The separation did not remove disagreements over when he would see them, how long they would stay with him, or when they would be returned. On December 21st, Baxter failed to return the children at the agreed time and indicated that he might keep them for several more days. 5 days later, the situation escalated again. On December 26, Hannah met Baxter at a skate park. During that meeting, Baxter took 4-year-old Laianah against Hannah's wishes and left with her. He then traveled interstate with the child. For Hannah, the situation was frightening. But because no family court parenting orders were yet in place, police faced limits on what they could immediately do through family law processes. Hannah contacted police, and Senior Constable Kent continued assisting her. Police began taking formal domestic violence action against Baxter. He was served with a police protection notice, placing temporary conditions on his behavior, while an application for a protection order moved through the court. Laianah was returned to Hannah. The separation was now increasingly involving police, lawyers, and the courts. On January 8, 2020, a temporary protection order was issued. It restricted Baxter from committing domestic violence against Hannah, approaching her residence, and contacting her, except in limited circumstances. At the same time, parenting arrangements still had to be worked out. Later that month, an interim arrangement was negotiated. The children would primarily live with Hannah, while Baxter was allowed contact with them at specified times. That arrangement did not bring an end to the conflict. By the end of January, the children were showing distress around some of their contact with Baxter. Then, on January 31st, another confrontation occurred. Hannah discovered private photographs of herself among Baxter's belongings. An argument followed, and Baxter grabbed Hannah by the wrist. Hannah's mother contacted police. Hannah later sought medical treatment and was diagnosed with a sprained wrist. The incident was significant because Baxter was already subject to the temporary protection order. Police began considering whether his actions amounted to both an assault and a breach of that order. After the January 31 incident, Hannah's lawyers informed Baxter that the existing face-to-face parenting arrangement would no longer continue. Hannah still facilitated scheduled video calls between him and the children. The boundaries had changed. The separation increasingly limited the access and influence Baxter had previously exercised within the family. Police continued investigating the January 31 incident and issued Baxter notices requiring him to appear in court over the allegations. At the same time, Hannah was continuing with the ordinary responsibilities of raising 3 young children, living with her parents, working, dealing with lawyers, and managing contact between the children and their father. By early February, Hannah had created more distance than at any previous point in the relationship. She was living with her parents. Police and lawyers were involved. A protection order was in place, and contact with Baxter had become more restricted. But managing the separation had become a constant part of her daily life. On February 10, 2020, Hannah told a colleague that she believed Baxter could kill her if he ever got her alone. She had also begun talking about making a will. By then, Hannah had already separated, obtained legal protection, and restricted Baxter's face-to-face access after the January 31 incident. On February 14, police served Baxter with a notice requiring him to appear in court over the common assault allegation connected to Hannah's injured wrist. By mid-February, several parts of Baxter's life had changed. The marriage had ended, the gym had closed, his access to the children was more restricted, and police and courts were now involved. During the final days, Baxter continued talking to people about the separation and his contact with the children. He also contacted support services. But the later coronial inquest found that Baxter had planned the killings in the days before February 19. They were not treated as a sudden or impulsive reaction to an argument. On February 18th, Baxter made a video call to the children. The next morning, Hannah was preparing for an ordinary school run from her parents' home in Camp Hill. Aaliyah was 6 years old. Laianah was 4. Trey was 3. Hannah placed the children in the family vehicle and prepared to take them to school. Baxter was nearby. As Hannah began the journey, he approached the vehicle and forced his way inside. The vehicle traveled only a short distance before stopping on Raven Street, where Baxter carried out the attack. He used petrol to set the vehicle on fire, while Hannah and the 3 children were inside. People nearby quickly realized something was terribly wrong and tried to help. Emergency services were called to the scene. Hannah managed to get out of the vehicle and was taken to the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. Aaliyah, Laianah, and Trey died at the scene. Despite medical treatment, Hannah died later that day. She was 31 years old. Baxter also died at the scene. Because Baxter also died, there could be no murder trial. The task of reconstructing what had happened would instead fall to investigators and, later, the coronial inquest. For Hannah's parents, Sue and Lloyd Clarke, the loss was almost impossible to comprehend. Their daughter and all 3 of their grandchildren had been killed in a single morning. Across Australia, the deaths generated widespread grief and anger. Attention soon turned not only to the attack itself, but also to the warning signs that had existed beforehand and the systems that had already been involved in Hannah's life. Hannah had separated from Baxter. She had spoken to police. A protection order was in place. Lawyers had become involved. She had restricted Baxter's face-to-face access after another confrontation, and she had told someone plainly that she believed he could kill her. Those facts became central to the wider discussion surrounding the case because they showed that the danger had developed through an established pattern of control rather than one isolated incident. Hannah, Aaliyah, Laianah, and Trey were remembered by their family as 4 people whose lives were connected by far more than the way they ended. In the days after the murders, scrutiny quickly turned to the systems that had interacted with Hannah before February 19th. That scrutiny intensified after Detective Inspector Mark Thompson of the Queensland Police Service publicly questioned whether Baxter had been driven too far. The wording drew widespread criticism. Queensland Police Commissioner Katarina Carroll apologized, and Thompson stepped away from the investigation. For many people following the case, the controversy reflected a broader problem. Domestic violence was still too often framed as a reaction to relationship conflict, rather than as a pattern of power and control. In March 2022, a coronial inquest examined the deaths and the decisions made in the months before them. After 10 days of evidence, Deputy State Coroner Jane Bentley delivered her findings on June 29th. The coroner found that Baxter had subjected Hannah to a prolonged pattern of coercive control. The individual behaviors documented throughout the relationship were significant because, viewed together, they showed an ongoing effort to restrict Hannah's independence and maintain control over her. The coroner also found that the killings were planned, rejecting the idea that they were a spontaneous response to the pressures of separation. The inquest also considered retaliatory filicide, the killing of children as a means of punishing or retaliating against the other parent. That concept was relevant because Baxter's efforts to maintain control had increasingly involved access to Aaliyah, Laianah, and Trey. The findings also made clear that Hannah's fear was genuine. Her concerns were not simply part of a parenting dispute. She had accurately recognized that Baxter posed a serious danger. But the inquest also identified serious weaknesses in the systems around Hannah and the children. Different agencies had seen different parts of the situation, but the overall level of risk had not been fully recognized. The coroner identified missed opportunities to hold Baxter more accountable, particularly after the January 31 assault allegation and the possible breach of the protection order. There was also concern that Aaliyah, Laianah, and Trey had not been sufficiently assessed as potential victims of serious harm in their own right. The coroner recommended stronger police training in coercive control and risk assessment, more specialized domestic violence responses, and greater investment in programs aimed at changing abusive behavior. Outside the courtroom, Hannah's parents, Sue and Lloyd Clarke, became prominent advocates for reform. They established small steps for Hannah in memory of Hannah, Aaliyah, Laianah, and Trey. Through the foundation and their public advocacy, they helped push coercive control further into the national conversation. The case helped shift attention toward a reality that had been easy to miss. Serious domestic abuse can develop through repeated control over someone's movements, relationships, communication, finances, and choices long before severe physical violence occurs. Queensland later created a standalone criminal offence of coercive control. The offence came into effect on May 26, 2025, carrying a maximum penalty of 14 years in prison. The reform is often associated publicly with the name Hannah's Law, although that is not its formal legal title. Hannah's case did not single-handedly produce coercive control laws across Australia, but it became one of the country's most influential cases in changing how that form of abuse was understood, discussed, and addressed. At the center of that conversation are still four people: Hannah Clarke, Aaliyah Baxter, Laianah Baxter, Trey Baxter. Their names became closely connected to reform, but they were a mother and three children before they became symbols of a national conversation. Hannah was a daughter, mother, athlete, and woman trying to build a safer life for herself and her children. Aaliyah, Laianah, and Trey were three young children whose lives were still unfolding. Their deaths changed the way many people understood coercive control, but the reforms that followed should never become the only reason they are remembered. Their names now carry public meaning, but first, they belong to a family. If you value carefully researched, victim-centered true crime documentaries, like the video and subscribe.